Hi, my sweet friends, and welcome back to Crochet Every Day with Judy. We're continuing our Dickens stories about children, and today's story is Tiny Tim. It will surprise you all very much to hear that there was once a man who did not like Christmas. In fact, he had been heard on several occasions to use the word humbug with regard to it. His name was Scrooge, and he was a hard, sour-tempered man of business, intent only on saving and making money and caring nothing for anyone. He paid the poor, hard-working clerk in his office as little as he could possibly get the work done for, and lived on as little as possible himself, alone, in 2 dismal rooms. He was never merry or comfortable or happy, and he hated other people to be so. And that was the reason he hated Christmas, because people will be happy at Christmas, you know, if they possibly can, and like to have a little money to make themselves and others comfortable. Well, it was Christmas Eve, a very cold and foggy one, and Mr. Scrooge, having given his poor clerk unwilling permission to spend Christmas Day at home, locked up in his office and went home himself, in a very bad temper and with a cold in his head. After having taken some gruel, he sat over a miserable fire in his dismal room. He got into bed and had some wonderful and disagreeable dreams, to which we will leave him, while we see how Tiny Tim, the son of his poor clerk, spent Christmas Day. The name of this clerk was Bob Cratchit. He had a wife and 5 other children besides Tim, who was a weak and delicate little cripple, and for this reason was dearly loved by his father and the rest of the family. Not but what he was a dear little boy, too, gentle and patient and loving, with a sweet face of his own, which no one could help looking at. Whenever he could spare the time, it was Mr. Cratchit's delight to carry his little boy out on his shoulder to see the shops and the people, and today he had taken him to church for the first time. "Whatever has got your precious father and your brother Tiny Tim?" exclaimed Mrs. Cratchit. "Here's dinner, all ready to be dished up. I've never known him so late on Christmas Day before." "Here he is, Mother," cried Belinda. "Here he is," cried the other children. In came little Bob, the father, with at least 3 feet of comforter, exclusive of the fringe, hanging down before him, and his threadbare clothes darned up and brushed to look seasonable, and Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas for Tiny Tim, he bore a little crutch and had his limbs supported by an iron frame. "Why, where's our Martha?" cried Bob Cratchit, looking round. "Not coming," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Not coming," said Bob, with a sudden declension in his high spirits, for he had been Tim's blood horse all the way from church and had come home rampant. "Not coming upon Christmas Day?" Martha didn't like to see him disappointed if it were only in joke, so she came out prematurely from behind the closet door and ran into his arms, while the 2 young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim and bore him off into the wash-house, that he might hear the pudding singing in the copper. "And how did Tim behave?" asked Mrs. Cratchit. "As good as gold and better," replied his father. "I think, wife, the child gets thoughtful sitting at home so much. He told me, coming home, that he hoped the people in church who saw he was a cripple would be pleased to remember on Christmas Day who it was made the lame to walk." "Bless his sweet heart," said the mother in a trembling voice, and the father's voice trembled too, as he remarked that Tiny Tim was growing strong and hearty at last. His active little crutch was heard upon the floor, and back came Tiny Tim before another word was spoken, escorted by his brother and sister to a stool beside the fire, while Bob, Master Peter, and the 2 ubiquitous young Cratchits went to fetch the goose, with which they soon returned in high procession. Such a bustle ensued that you might have thought a goose the rarest of all birds, a feathered phenomenon, to which a black swan was a matter of course, and in truth it was something very like it in that house. Mrs. Cratchit made the gravy ready beforehand in a little saucepan, hissing hot. Mr. Peter mashed the potatoes with incredible vigor. Miss Belinda sweetened up the applesauce. Martha dusted the hot plates. Bob took Tiny Tim beside him in a tiny corner at the table. The 2 young Cratchits set chairs for everybody, not forgetting themselves, and mounting guard upon their post, crammed spoons into their mouths, lest they should shriek for goose before their turn came to be helped. At last the dishes were set on, and grace was said. It was succeeded by a breathless pause, as Mrs. Cratchit, looking slowly all along the carving knife, prepared to plunge it in the breast. But when she did, and when the long-expected gush of stuffing issued forth, one murmur of delight arose all round the board, and even Tiny Tim, excited by the 2 young Cratchits, beat on the table with the handle of his knife and feebly cried, "Hurrah!" There never was such a goose. Bob said he didn't believe there ever was such a goose cooked. Its tenderness and flavor, size and cheapness were the themes of universal admiration. Eked out by applesauce and mashed potatoes, it was a sufficient dinner for the whole family. Indeed, as Mrs. Cratchit said with great delight, surveying one small atom of a bone upon the dish, they hadn't eaten it all at that. Yet everyone had had enough, and the youngest Cratchits in particular were steeped in sage and onions to the eyebrows. But now, the plates being changed by Miss Belinda, Mrs. Cratchit left the room alone, too nervous to bear witness, to take the pudding up and bring it in. Suppose it should not be done enough. Suppose it should break in turning out. Suppose somebody should have gotten over the wall of the backyard and stolen it while they were merry with the goose, a supposition at which the two young Cratchits became livid. All sorts of horrors were supposed. Hallo, a great deal of steam. The pudding was out of the copper. A smell like a washing day. That was the cloth. A smell like an eating house and a pastry cook's next door to each other, with a laundress next door to that. That was the pudding. In half a minute Mrs. Cratchit entered, flushed but smiling proudly, with the pudding like a speckled cannonball, so hard and firm, blazing in half a quartern of ignited brandy, and bedight with Christmas holly stuck into the top. Oh, a wonderful pudding! Bob Cratchit said, and calmly too, that he regarded it as the greatest success achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. Mrs. Cratchit said that now the weight was off her mind, she would confess she had had her doubts about the quantity of flour. Everybody had something to say about it, but nobody said or thought it was a small pudding for a large family. It would have been flat heresy to do so. Any Cratchit would have blushed to hint at such a thing. At last the dinner was all done, the cloth was cleared, the hearth swept, and the fire made up. The compound in the jug being tasted and considered perfect, apples and oranges were put upon the table, and a shovelful of chestnuts on the fire. Then all the Cratchit family drew round the hearth in what Bob Cratchit called a circle, meaning half a one, and at Bob Cratchit's elbow stood the family display of glass, 2 tumblers and a custard cup without a handle. These held the hot stuff from the jug, however, as well as golden goblets would have done. And Bob served it out with beaming looks, while the chestnuts on the fire sputtered and crackled noisily. Then Bob proposed, "A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears. God bless us," which all the family re-echoed. "God bless us, every one," said Tiny Tim, the last of all. Now I told you that Mr. Scrooge had some disagreeable and wonderful dreams on Christmas Eve, and so he had. In one of them, he dreamed that a Christmas spirit showed him his clerk's home. He saw them all gathered round the fire and heard them drink his health and Tiny Tim's song, and he took special note of Tiny Tim himself. How Mr. Scrooge spent Christmas Day we do not know. He may have remained in bed, having a cold, but on Christmas night he had more dreams, in which the spirit took him again to his clerk's poor home. Seated by the table, the mother was doing some needlework. A tear dropped on it now and then, and she said, poor thing, that the work, which was black, hurt her eyes. The children sat sad and silent about the room, except Tiny Tim, who was not there. Upstairs, the father, with his face hidden in his hands, sat beside a little bed on which lay a tiny figure, white and still. "My little child, my pretty little child," he sobbed as the tears fell through his fingers onto the floor. "Tiny Tim died because his father was too poor to give him what was necessary to make him well. You kept him poor," said the dream spirit to Mr. Scrooge. The father kissed the cold little face on the bed and went downstairs, where the sprays of holly still remained about the humble room, and taking his hat, went out with a wistful glance at the little crutch in the corner as he shut the door. Mr. Scrooge saw all this and many more things as strange and sad. The spirit took care of that, but wonderful to relate, he woke the next morning feeling a different man, feeling as he had never felt in his life before. "Why, I am as light as a feather and as happy as an angel and as merry as a schoolboy," he said to himself as he absolutely skipped into the next room to breakfast and threw on all the coal at once and put 2 lumps of sugar in his tea. "I hope everybody had a Merry Christmas, and here's a Happy New Year to all the world." Poor Bob Cratchit crept into the office a few minutes late, expecting to be roundly abused and scolded for it, but no such thing. His master was there with his back to a good fire and actually smiling, and he shook hands with his clerk, telling him heartily that he was going to raise his salary, and asking quite affectionately after Tiny Tim. "And mind you make up a good fire in your room before you set to work, Bob," he said as he closed his own door. Bob could hardly believe his eyes and ears, but it was all true. Such doings as they had on New Year's Day had never been seen before in the Cratchits' home. nor such a turkey as Mr. Scrooge sent them for dinner. Tiny Tim had his share too, for Tiny Tim did not die, not a bit of it. Mr. Scrooge was a second father to him from that day. He wanted for nothing and grew up strong and hearty. Mr. Scrooge loved him, and well he might, for was it not Tiny Tim who had unconsciously, through the Christmas dream spirit, touched his hard heart and caused him to become a good and happy man? That story was from Dickens' A Christmas Carol. We'll stop there and start next time with The Runaway Couple. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.